We celebrate anniversaries all of the time in this country, but some anniversaries are singular, like a special one that was observed in April 2018. Which anniversary was it, and why was it notable? Find out on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. April 4th, 2018 marks the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If asked, some would say that there has been a lot of progress made when it comes to the improvement of race relations in the U.S. since King's assassination. There are others who would point to indicators that might show a lack of progress. So how far has America come in granting equal rights and equal opportunities for all within our country's borders? I'm delighted that on this show we have Dr. Clayborne Carson to answer that question. Dr. Carson is a history professor at Stanford University and the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. As some of you might remember, he was selected in 1985 by Dr. King's widow, Coretta Scott King, to edit and publish Dr. King's papers. In 2005, the King Papers Project became part of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Carson, for joining us, and it's a pleasure to have you again on the show.
It's great to be back.
Yes, the last time you were here, it was in 2013. Now, you just now heard me say, and our viewers heard me say, that you were selected by Coretta Scott King to edit her husband's papers. Tell us why. Why do you think she selected you?
I think she was looking for someone who had a connection to the movement, and I did. I had been involved in the movements of the 1960s, and I had written a book called End Struggle about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which sometimes was King's nemesis. You know, they were the younger people who thought that they were in the vanguard and King was trying to catch up with them. But she saw me as someone who had a strong interest in the field, could perhaps approach Dr. King's papers from the point of view of somebody who was knowledgeable, but you know, I did have a different perspective at the time, and I think that one of the things we talked out, she came out here to California, and we talked in San Francisco, and I think she gained confidence that I was the person to do it.
Did she know you personally?
We had met once, but I'm sure that, you know, it was one of those things where I was in a library and she was there and we shook hands, but I'm sure she had long since forgotten me. The reason why she knew about me in 1985 was that we had a mutual friend, John Hope Franklin, the eminent historian of African American history, was her historical advisor. And he was the one who said, you know, why don't you think about Clay Carson? And she gave me a call, and actually at first I was a little bit skeptical because I had always kind of had the SNCC perspective of Martin Luther King, that he was cautious and not quite as militant as some of the students. You know, my first acquaintance in the movement was Stokely Carmichael, who was later Dr. King's antagonist during the Mississippi March.
Yes, and Stokely Carmichael was a college classmate of mine, so I can remember those differences of opinion. And that's what you mean when you said you had a different perspective at that time.
Yeah, I was, you know, I had met Stokely Carmichael in 1963, and I knew many of the people in SNCC. I later, you know, a little bit later that year, I met Bob Moses, and in fact, I considered going participating in the Mississippi Summer Project in 1964. So, so I think I was closest to the perspective of the young people. You know, when I went to the march, you know, other people were there waiting for King, and I was too. I mean, I had heard about his skill as an orator and all of that. But I was also interested in hearing John Lewis, because he was the youngest speaker at the march, and he was the one representing the generation of students that I was a part of.
What did you think of King during the march and that,
well, you know,
that famous speech?
I think, like a lot of people, I greatly admired him because he was the one who was the symbol. You know, there was no question that people saw him as the one who was the most articulate spokesperson for the movement. And I, you know, I, like everyone else, you know, one of the reasons why they put him last as the speaker is that no one wanted to follow him.
Sure.
I mean, if anyone had been the next speaker, all the crowd would have left because they would have been rushing to get to their cars, get to their buses, but everyone wanted to stay and listen to Dr. King.
Now, you heard John Lewis. When we talk about the Civil Rights March in 1963, I don't think Lewis's name comes up, does it?
For most people, for me, I think he gave a great speech, and because he was talking from the perspective of the people who were involved in the movement in the Deep South. He was the one who, I remember him saying, "One man, one vote is the African cry, it is ours too." And so he expressed that kind of militancy that I think I felt at that time. I was 19 years old at that time, so I was still a teenager and kind of had that sense of impatience that many teenagers still have. You know, why doesn't it change? Why didn't it change yesterday? Why are we still fighting for this?
And we could still ask that question.
Of course, I hope every generation asks that question.
For good reasons, because one would say there are a lot of changes still to be made.
Of course, I don't think that we've realized King's dream.
Well, we have a video, an excerpt from a video, the first 6 minutes, that you were very much involved in. So before we see it, could you say a few words about it?
Well, this was a documentary film I worked on, and it's done by Paramount, and it was broadcast last week on, I guess, on April 4th. And it's a 90-minute documentary about Dr. King's life, and I was one of the people interviewed in it, and it was like all documentaries, you try to tell a story, and in this case, it's the story of King from the time when he is young and just going into the ministry, his time in Montgomery, all the way to Memphis.
Well, we have, as I mentioned, 6 minutes of it that we'll see as soon as we could bring it up now, and then we could talk about it a little bit afterwards.
Okay, sure.
Going after everybody else?
I see where we are today in this modern day fight against injustice, against police brutality, against bigotry and racism. It's very much just like the civil rights movement.
Freedom, equality, equity, all of these things that truly matter, and we got to speak on it, and we got to continue to speak on it.
Walking down Freedom Trail. I ain't gonna let no fear turn me around.
There's not enough we could say for a man that fought fear and anxiety and kept coming.
Keep on walking, keep on talking, walking down Freedom Trail. I ain't gonna let.
King was talking to a nation about the power of love, not the love of power. Talking to a nation about the power of forgiveness.
He's the final founder of American democracy, and he's a black man.
Keep on talking, walking down Freedom Trail. Oh, freedom. Oh,
Life for each of us is a journey, and Martin King is no different in that regard.
He was just a dude. He was just a guy who was struggling through his own frustrations, his own exhaustion. But in the end, he just found ways to use his gifts in exceptional ways.
I advocate a militant nonviolence, a resistance movement that does resist, but it does it nonviolently.
The man was just amazing with how he told a story, how he delivered words, and did it with so much vigor and so much passion, and walked the walk.
People don't understand the level of physical violence that was directed against this man every single day. He was beaten so many times at marches that it was almost a joke.
There is always, always, always a price to pay for truth-telling. He was willing to sacrifice himself for all the rest of us. And that's a deep, radical empathy. That's a deep, rich kind of love.
He just come here from Atlanta. He was checking into the hotel. And there was a certain joy there because we were really kind of rolling.
I hadn't seen him that jovial and clowning and free in a long time. He was just in a very playful mood. One of the reporters said, "Now, Andy, I know you don't like us getting in your face with the camera, but I got to keep a camera on Dr. King, because if he gets shot and I don't get a picture of it, I'll lose my job." Martin thought that was funny. And he said, "Now, I tell you what's gonna happen. They might take a shot at me, but one of you all will be jumping in front and take it for me." Somebody knocked on the door and said, "You're supposed to be at dinner at 6 o'clock. You all need to get rest."
Jesse Jackson and some others are downstairs. Martin's on the balcony, they're downstairs. And Martin yells out to Jesse, "Jesse, time to go to dinner, man. Put your suit on."
And I said, "Dr. King, the prerequisite for eating is not a tie, but an appetite." He said, "You're crazy." And we laughed. Doctor, pow! He was dead on the impact. The whole world changed. It shook the world. It shook the world.
If I can help.
Every day I miss my friend, my teacher, my pastor, my mentor, my conscience.
Once I saw that the shot hit home, and I realized he was going home, I was worried about how we keep going. Because the one thing we couldn't do was let a bullet stop the movement.
Then my living shall not be in vain.
Dr. King is a proud product of the Southern black middle class. He was basically a part of the black aristocracy, the black elite. We call him Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because his dad was already famous. Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. was a big deal in Atlanta. And Dr. King is the preacher's son, the shining light. He goes up north, he gets highly educated.
I moved to Atlanta to go to college at Morehouse College, where Dr. King went to school, and we're taught there at Morehouse about the importance of standing up when we feel it was necessary.
My mother always said to me, you must never feel that you are less than anybody else. You must always feel that you are somebody, and you must feel that you are as good as anybody else. And of course, this came up with me in spite of the fact that I still confronted the system of segregation every day.
It is bizarre that Dr. King did 90% of the stuff that he did. He has made a radical break with everything he was prepared to do socially because of something that called on him spiritually and morally.
Martin Luther.
Well, I am sure that that segment brings back a lot of memories for you.
Of course, you know, every time I see, you know, each of these films has a different take on Martin Luther King, and it's almost like he is this person that they're trying to get, what is the essence of Martin Luther King? You know, people see him as a public figure and, you know, on the television screen, but I think all these documentaries, including this one that I worked on.
You were the executive producer
Yes.
of this one.
And actually you cut off right when I was coming on the screen.
Oh,
so.
sorry about that.
But in any case, it's people who know a lot about Martin Luther King, either from personal experience or like myself, who studied him. We wanted to get the perspectives of those people so that he would emerge as a human being, not as this icon of history.
Sure, well, we can talk more about him as an icon of history. But in that segment that we saw, Sean King, who is very much involved in the Black Lives Movement, said that what is happening in our country today is very similar to what was happening in the 60s at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Do you agree with that?
I don't know, at the height, I think the equivalent time is that what's going on right now seems to me the late 50s, before the movement became a mass movement. I think that when you look back, you see that any kind of struggle begins with immediate concerns. You know, when you think about getting a better seat on a Montgomery bus, being able to sit at a lunch counter, those were immediate things that you know, affected your daily life, and that's what motivated people to get involved in the first place. And it took a while before that became a mass movement, where you begin to see the connections between sitting on the bus and sitting at the lunch counter and not having a good job and not having, you know, opportunities. All of those things become more evident once you are involved in a movement. So I think on the, you know, when I think back of how I was feeling in August of 1963 when I went to the March on Washington, you know, I didn't know at that time that I was involved in a mass movement. I mean, if you think back, probably the total number of people were involved in the movement was a few thousand people.
Let's go back a moment. You said that what's going on now was more like what it was in the 50s.
I think it's the early stages of the movement.
So if we go by that, then what would be the comparable things to not having a seat on the bus, the job opportunities?
Black men, unarmed black men being shot by police.
Okay.
Problems like, you know, the way in which, you know, people began to mobilize over income, you know, the Occupy movement, you know, things like that.
Lack of housing?
Lack of housing. I think that there's lots
high incarceration rates?
High incarceration, mass incarceration. I think all of these things are symptoms. And the question really becomes for a movement, what is the cause of all of these symptoms? And how can the various people who are concerned about each individual symptom finally find a way of getting together and say, okay, we're going to change.
So let's talk about, we could say in the 60s, or in the 50s, the cause was racism?
I think in the 50s, again, no one would have expressed it that way. It would have been, we can't sit at the front of the bus, not racism as this big issue.
Well, why couldn't we sit in the front of the bus?
That's something you learn as you begin to protest against not being able to sit in the bus. Remember when...
Or drink at the fountain, or being relegated to black only.
You have to remember when the boycott started, it wasn't even a boycott to desegregate the buses. It was to get more polite treatment under segregation. What people were actually protesting against, and you can go back and look at the original demands.
Montgomery bus boycott.
The Montgomery bus boycott, the original demand was simply that passengers be treated, if you already had your seat, you didn't have, Rosa Parks, you didn't have to get up from that seat. You still had the segregation.
So are you saying that if that demand had been met, if people could sit on the bus without having to get up to give a white person their seat and had been treated more politely, that we might not have had the movement?
No.
Oh, you're not saying that.
No, I'm definitely not saying that. I'm saying that the Montgomery bus boycott might have settled for less. But then there would have been still other, the causes of the sit-ins, the freedom rides, all of these started over particular issues, and they gradually became larger issues.
So,
and in part because of people like Martin Luther King, because he was the one, if you go back and look at his speech in Montgomery, he might have just talked about the boycott for better treatment on the buses. But if you go back and look at that speech, he says, no, that's not what it's about. It's about the Declaration of Independence. It's about the Sermon on the Mount. So he's already saying that it's about something more than you start with.
So let's continue the analogy between the 50s and what we have now. So if what we have now might be the beginnings, like the Montgomery boycott was, bus boycott, what do you see in the future going forward?
I think people will begin to see the connections between among these movements. And the notion of, you talk about racism, civil rights, equal citizenship rights. That's what the 60s, 50s, and 60s were about. Being treated equally as a citizen.
So
what I'm saying now is that it's being treated equally as a human being.
What always leaves a question for me, and it's something that you said more or less, like, why don't we have these things? So why is there the inequality? Why is there the need not to treat people equally? What is it? Because
people gain an advantage from it. I mean, if you look at movements, freedom movements, justice movements throughout history, every time you overcome one form of injustice, what happens?
There is another form.
There's another form, because the people who benefited from slavery didn't die after the end of slavery. They still wanted to benefit from racial domination. So instead of slavery, you have the Jim Crow system coming into its place. And as the Jim Crow system began to crumble in the 1960s, those people who supported it did not go away. They did not say, oh, yes, we need to provide equal opportunity for black people in the society. Instead, created other forms of oppression.
So you're saying these are intentional forms of oppression for dominance, for power,
for profit,
for money?
Yeah, all of the above. for the privileges that you gained under the previous system. You know, white people in America have gained a privilege. You know, under slavery, it was obvious. You got to be the master, the other person got to be the slave. In the Jim Crow system, it was obvious. You got to be the dominant group, other people, you know, you got opportunities that black people simply did not get. You know, they could not move where you could move. They could not get the jobs that you could get. They could not get into the colleges that you could get into. When that system of dominance came apart, it didn't mean that suddenly the United States became a nation of equality. It just simply meant that there were different ways of accomplishing the same goal. You know, the segregation didn't end with the passage of the Housing Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of '64. America is still a very segregated society. If you look at if you define segregation as black people going to predominantly black schools, that is just as prevalent today as it was in 1954.
So in the movie, Andy Young says he didn't want the bullet that killed King to stop the movement. Did the movement stop? And why is it?
I think.
Why is it that what you just now said, America being just as segregated with everything that happened, how is it that this is where we still are?
Well, we have to admit that certain gains were made. I mean, you can't have a rental property or a home and say this is only available to white people. That ended. But you can accomplish pretty much the same goal by other means. And I think that's what has happened in American society, is that we've become complacent. You know, there was a sense of complacency after the passage of Civil Rights Acts, that it became you know, we've progressed as a nation. We're no longer, and when you look at King's life, you know, like in that documentary, what comes immediately after the passage of the Voting Rights Act? He goes to Watts. And within a few months, he goes to Chicago. And what does he find? Mobs that are, in his view, more vicious than any mob that he had ever faced in the South. And what are they fighting for? To keep their neighborhoods segregated, to keep their schools segregated.
Now, is that because of a need for dominance? Would they say we want to be dominant? We want to have the power? We don't want to share?
No, it means that you're protecting your privilege. You know, that's all it means.
Is it fear?
Of course it's fear.
Fear of?
It's fear of, you were living in a white suburb where you bought your home in the 1950s for $5,000 or less. And now it's in the late 60s and into the 70s, and that home is worth $50,000. You want to protect that. You think that that is yours. That is what you have earned. But you forget the fact that the reason why you were able to get that house in the first place is because the neighborhood was segregated. And you didn't face any competition from black buyers because they could not get homes in that neighborhood. They could not go to the schools that your kid is going to.
And there is no way in people's minds that we could still have our house, we could still let other people in, and there is enough to go around? Or is it the idea of that scarcity?
What you're saying is perfectly reasonable. It doesn't explain why there were mobs preventing that from happening, preventing a black person from moving in. Just as, you know, Birmingham was called Bombingham because of a black person moved from this street 10 blocks away, and there's a white neighborhood, and that person bought a home in that neighborhood somehow. That would be a target for bombing. Now, in Chicago, it would have happened in a different way. There would have been people gathering outside that home of the black person who moved in, throwing rocks, doing other kinds of things. They might not have used dynamite, but it would have accomplished the same purpose, saying, you're not welcome here.
So I earlier said racism.
But that takes into a lot of territory. There's lots of different forms. That's what I'm saying, is that the form of racism under slavery was not the same as the form of racism under the Jim Crow system, is not the same as the form of racism
But it's
we have.
racism just the same. How would you define it? Would you define one race saying that they are better than another race and therefore deserve the privileges, deserve the power?
There's always a tendency to believe that if you are dominant, if you have the privilege, that you deserve it. You don't see that someone else has been denied that right. You know, if you have, you know, one of the things that you begin to see in the period after 1965, affirmative action. Okay, you look at a person who says, you know, look, I worked really hard. I passed the civil service exam. I am now a fireman. And I got this job legitimately. And someone comes to you and said, but the reason why you have it is because historically black people have been prevented from becoming firemen. Are you going to suddenly say, oh, well, you know, look, I just...
That was in the past.
That was in the past. Has nothing to do with me. I deserve what I have. And I'm not going to allow a system where a black person gets a privileged position for the next fire person's job.
So what it seems like, we will constantly have to go through, no matter how many gains that are made going forward, a mentality that says there isn't enough to go around, and one race deserves...
What I'm saying is that historical injustices are hard to correct. I mean, you know, and this applies to everyone. You know, we're sitting here in Palo Alto. Whose land is this?
Whose land is it?
200 years ago, it was Ohlone Indians. It was their land. How did it come to be our land?
Or how did Texas come to be ours?
Yeah,
or New Mexico, or Arizona?
And then once you answer those questions by going back into history, what does that mean? Does that mean that, okay, in that example, there's very few Ohlone Indians left to inherit the land. So what do we do to correct that injustice?
Well, you said historical injustices are some of the hardest to correct. Are there other injustices that are easier to correct?
Oh, of course. I think, you know, the whole notion of affirmative action comes out of basic American, actually common law. It says if somebody does you an injury, you know, hits you with a car, and you suffer because of that injury, you can come back and say, I want compensation. You have injured me. But what if the injury happened 100 years ago?
And one talks about reparations.
That becomes a harder discussion because 100 years ago, that was not you, that was your grandparents. And are you the legitimate person to get the compensation? You weren't injured as a person.
But what they're finding now is that those historical injustices don't end, that they continue on.
But that to me is, that's because in studying history, we can't, absolutely, I can never no one can ever compensate the slave for what the slave went through.
Or the slaves.
But understanding that there
heirs.
was a slave system of slavery and it had long-term consequences might help us to mentally adjust to the notion that we have to do something in the present.
Well, that's...
And it might be reparations. I actually think reparations is probably not the best approach. But it might be, for example, providing other avenues of opportunity for people who have been denied
well, what
opportunity.
you run into, you can look at history and that gives you perspective. You can see the problems, but it doesn't necessarily give you the solutions.
Of course not, yeah.
And whatever solutions you run into, and I'd love to discuss them with you, might still run into the opposition.
I think what King was trying to do in his lifetime, he was very conscious of historical injustice. He had, you know, and I think that's true of most black leaders. They study history, they understand that something really bad happened. Slavery, the Jim Crow system. But I think for him, the solution was you make our present society as just and as providing as much equal opportunity as possible for everyone.
Yes, but we don't have that. And what we're here now is talking about how what we currently have is comparable to what we had in the 50s. So it seems the mindset hasn't changed, that mindset of dominance, that mindset of power.
So the question, how do you deal with that?
Yes.
And I think what King was saying is that you provide opportunities that are not necessarily race-based, you know, things like a guaranteed income. Well, a guaranteed income is available to everyone in societies where they are, you know, basically have a guaranteed income today. They're available to anyone. It's not race-based.
Yes.
But obviously, poor people are going to benefit more from a guaranteed income than rich people.
Would that guaranteed income then allow them to live wherever they want to live, or allow their children to go to school with other people's children?
It might not have the kind of immediate result of that, but if you know, just to take an example, right now, school segregation is one of the, I think, major factors in inequality in the United States. If you allowed poor black people to go to have equal educational opportunities, to be able to go to better schools, how are you going to do that? Well, you have to provide housing, not just desegregation, but integration. In other words, you have to provide ways for poor, low-income people to live in middle-class neighborhoods where they can go to middle-class schools.
Well,
and that's where you get the opposition.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
It's the attitude of not in my neighborhood.
Yes, exactly.
And that's here in Palo Alto as well as any place else.
So how do you, we know and we hear all the time how children of color aren't doing as well as those in more affluent neighborhoods. We know what the problems are, but then how do you then get people to recognize somehow that it would be better for society, for the nation, if these children of color had better schooling? How do you get people to come to that recognition or to care?
You know, I think a lot of people understand that theoretically, but how many of us would vote to have low-income housing in our neighborhood?
Well, is it a matter of just low-income housing? Of course, there was busing.
That is a symptom of the problem. You wouldn't need busing. You know, the Housing Act of 1968 was not just about ending discrimination in housing. The goal of it was to bring about integrated housing, which would have meant, for example, government supported housing would have to be in a, right now, if you want to build a housing project for poor people, you build it in a poor neighborhood, which makes no sense at all. If you really want to make a change, you would have to build the low-income housing in the suburbs, in the middle-class neighborhoods, because then, first of all, it would not be concentrated. Part of what we find is that problems become exacerbated. Problems of crime, other kinds of things become exacerbated if all poor people are concentrated in a particular neighborhood.
That, for some people, is too much of a change.
Of course it is.
Because their fear is, first of all, their property values will go down, the crime will go up, the neighborhood schools will deteriorate.
Of course.
So we get back to the idea.
That is all based around the notion that this will, that this burden would not be distributed throughout the society. Part of our not in our neighborhood mentality comes from the notion that I'm not going to take the entire burden. Yes, if you want to build a housing development for 200 families in my suburb, we can absorb that.
Would we, or would we move to another suburb?
Well, that's the point, is that the burden would have to be distributed. That we would have to
the question goes...
And the way in which you could do it, actually, is that a lot of housing is government funded. And under the Housing Act of 1968, any housing program that facilitates segregation is illegal. It's illegal under present law. We should not be doing this. We should not be building low-income housing in low-income neighborhoods. We should be building it throughout a city. But we violate the law. We ignore that part of the law.
How do we, and it seems it all goes back to, at least for me, this idea of privilege and dominance,
of course,
and power and money.
And again, that's not limited.
Nativism,
that's not limited
what we see
to
today.
white people.
That's true, but
if
how
you had
then...
a black suburb and you were talking about low-income housing, you might have the same kind of problem.
How then do you get through in changing that mentality?
It's tough, and that's why we're at where we are right now in the 21st century.
Well, it seems until we deal with that, we won't really make the changes that need to be made.
I think I wouldn't be a historian, I wouldn't be a scholar unless I felt that knowledge empowers people ultimately to do better.
Oh, you mean the arc
of the moral universe is long, but it bends.
It's been going now for how many thousands of years?
One of the things I think about that phrase is that, yes, it might bend toward justice, but we'll all be dead by then.
And then there'll be no need for it.
There is that pessimistic part of it, but you do see, I think, if I didn't think that people in the end can learn from history.
Yes, but the statistics coming out today in terms of the Holocaust is that many millennials don't know what it was all about. Mm-hmm. They don't have the basic facts. So how is it that the more we go forward in the future, the less of the past is taught, is remembered, is preserved, and so much gets lost?
I think that that's part of education. I think that there is a need. Obviously, I wouldn't have made that film. I wouldn't have written books if I didn't feel that gradually ideas like this get through. I think that Americans are more aware
to
of
enough
the past.
Of the people. How much, there's this idea that once a certain amount of the population, the tipping point, once a certain amount of people gravitate, get hold of an idea, then things change substantially. We've never reached it, have we?
Probably not, but I think that that's, in a way, there's purposeful amnesia. You know, if history tells you a lesson you don't want to learn.
Even with all of the education. Now, you do have people, for example, those who are trying to go to college campuses on the conservative side, who seem to be educated. They're aware of history, I'm sure. So it's like you can be so-called educated with academic training and still not, and still come to the conclusion of dominance, of one race having the privileges.
I mean, what you're saying is that there, you know, when you look back into the past, and this is probably statistically true, dominant classes were also the most educated class. They were the most skilled. Thomas Jefferson, he was the one who was the intellectual who basically shaped the ideology of this country. You know, we're talking about inalienable rights.
Yes,
at the same time, he went back and had slaves and had children by his slaves.
You had the Germans, I'm thinking, who were well-known philosophers and educators, and we had what we had in terms of 6 million people of Jewish.
Yeah, it doesn't.
It has nothing then to do with education, or I shouldn't say it has nothing to do with education, but education, while a critical factor.
One of King's early essays that he wrote while he was still in college was about that subject, that simply being more educated doesn't really make you more wise.
So what will do it?
Well, I think that we all have to be self-critical in the sense of there is always a rationale for dominance and injustice. There always will be, because the people who are dominant always have the power to create a rationale, a justification for why they are powerful.
So what you're saying is, those who are dominant, first of all, they're not going to give up their power or their privileges.
Easily.
And it's those who are dominant who make the laws, who are in control. Yeah. So the people who are not dominant, would they ever get to a place where they can be powerful? So under that scenario, we will always have these levels of injustice.
But that's why it's so important to have a person like Martin Luther King. Because I think that what he did, and the classic role of the educated black leader, from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King to, you know, whoever we could point out today, is to say, is the argument of hypocrisy. That is, to use Thomas Jefferson's words and say you're not living up to that. And it's one of the things I was involved in was designing the King Memorial in Washington. I don't know if you knew that, but I worked with Roma Design in San Francisco, and we developed the basic idea. And the idea was Martin Luther King on one side of the tidal basin, looking at, you know, who's on the other side?
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
Looking at Thomas Jefferson and the words of the I Have a Dream speech, in which he says that you wrote those words. All men are created equal, have certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But you have not lived up to that.
So, well, it's good to have those ideals. We have something to strive for.
And that's important. I think that every society wants to think of itself positively. You know, we have religious reasons to do that. We have philosophical reasons to do that. So even the slave master looked to the same Bible as the slave.
Now, that brings up the point that in today's world, there's so many sources of information. And we're dealing now with fake news. People can get their news from the internet, from television, from the radio, from social media.
But that's different from values. I think,
But how you get your news, does that not maybe shape your values? You can have the idealistic values that the country was founded upon, but then on a day-to-day level, those values.
And we see that. I mean, we see the way in which what I would call misinformation, as the, you know, I hesitate to use Trump's phrase, fake news, but misinformation. You know, I think that for most white Americans, they look at a problem like mass incarceration and say, well, that must be because black people
commit most of the
commit more crimes. But then when I look at, you know, just to bring it down home, you would think from arrest records that no drugs are used on the Stanford campus, because in the 40 years I've been there, I haven't seen very many Stanford students arrested for drugs.
And that doesn't mean they're not using them.
That doesn't, that definitely, I lived in the dorm for 4 years. I know that they use drugs, at least at the same level, because they have more money than the kid in East Palo Alto. Who is most likely to go to jail and spend prison times because of drugs? And this is not just using drugs. I'm talking about selling drugs, sharing drugs, you know, all of this. So the perception is this problem, that's the misinformation. This problem is caused by black people, you know, just commit more crimes. But then when you look at who's using the drugs, which is one of the main fuels of crime in any black community, is the drug market. In fact, if you talk about so many issues, immigration, you know, all of these kinds of things, and the emphasis on, oh, the reason why we don't want Mexicans crossing the border is they bring drugs. Well, who in the hell are they bringing the drugs for? They're not bringing them to Mexican communities to be sold. They're bringing them to white Americans to be sold. So it, you know, we see the problem through a prism that justifies what we want to believe about ourselves, that our kids are, you know, if you're a middle class, especially middle class white, our kids don't commit crimes.
Or if they do, there is a safety net.
Of course, and
resources that protect them.
And I've seen
rehabilitation centers.
I mean, one of the things that is also very, you actually have a mentality in the criminal justice system of, I don't, you know, a judge and a probation officer saying, I don't want to send this middle class white kid to the prison because they won't survive there.
And we had that with the Stanford rape case.
Of course.
So.
And why was that surprising? It shouldn't have been to anyone.
I guess it was just so.
It was just publicized.
And so obvious in terms of the level of treatment.
Anyone, and I've done this, anyone who sits in a courthouse, practically any place in the country, just go there. Challenge any of your listeners just to go and sit 1 day, 2 days, and see what happens in the criminal justice system. Who gets probation? Who gets another chance to go through a drug treatment program? Who gets a longer sentence? You know, and this is personal to me, because, you know, I have a brother who, you know, used drugs in the same way my Stanford students, but he served a year in prison for it, and that has affected the rest of his career. So I see the way in which this, you know, this is the way in which we don't really look at the kind of discriminating treatment that is given to people, especially from poor backgrounds, Because, you know, it's also true that a middle-class black kid who got caught with marijuana or cocaine or whatever is more likely to get diverted into treatment as opposed to going
if he's lucky,
to jail.
Or she's lucky.
Yeah.
Now, I cannot get away from the idea that what's going on now is related to what happened in the 50s. But the big thing that made the difference was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the movement.
I don't think so.
Oh,
actually.
I thought that's what I heard you say.
No, I think that he was the symbol of something else. I mean, if you look at the Montgomery bus boycott, he didn't start the Montgomery
No,
bus
he
boycott.
didn't.
He didn't start the sit-ins. He didn't start the voting rights campaign. He didn't start the freedom rides. It was not Martin Luther King who did the Mississippi Summer Project in 1964. It was not Martin Luther King who started the Selma to Montgomery voting rights march.
Yes, but Andy Young said that the bullet that killed him, he didn't want it to stop the movement.
And it didn't. There were a lot of other bullets that stopped the movement.
Okay, today, whom do we have? Do we have comparable symbols in the movement that is ongoing?
But see, if you put it in the context of the early 50s, who knew that Martin Luther King was going to become the symbol? I mean, if Martin Luther King, he got stabbed in 1958, if he had died, would we be talking about Martin Luther King today? I don't think so.
Well, it would be interesting.
He would have been seen as, oh, there was this movement back in Montgomery in 1955 and 6, and there was this guy, Martin Luther King. But later on, we had the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the voting rights campaign, Birmingham, you know, all this sort of stuff. And that was under other people, not Martin Luther King.
Well, it's because we did have King that we're sitting here today talking about a movement.
It was because King became the symbol of a movement.
Well, on that note, we'll end with the symbolism that King was in the past and what he represents in the present and also for the future.
I think he was the great symbol of that movement.
Dr. Carson, thank you so very much for giving us your perspective on the importance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in our lives, in our world, in our planet. Thank you so much for being here. And I'd like to thank our viewers for watching. Until next time.